Hi, everybody. I'm Shannon Kiernan. I'm the Manager of Digital Solutions at SEN and Senelec, and I'm taking care of the Digital Transformation Program. Today, I'm presenting to you the key initiatives that form part of that program. On the agenda, we have first up the strategy that we're supporting and the list of initiatives. Then one by one, we'll go through each of the initiatives. And then at the end, some really concrete advice for what happens if you have a request. What questions do you ask? How do you handle it? What can you do? So let's get started. Firstly, with the strategy and the list of initiatives. So perhaps you're aware of Strategy 2030. This was published earlier this year, and you can find it on Google very easily. Just type in Strategy 2030 SEN and Senelec, and there's a long document there that you can read much more about this. The point that I want to highlight for you is Goal 2, which is part of that. It says, our customers and stakeholders benefit from state-of-the-art digital solutions. Within that, we have 3 priorities: produce standards fit for the digital economy, transform the standards development process, and transforming our business models for the digital era. So like I said, you can read much more about it if you have a look at the document online, but basically our initiatives are supporting those 3 goals. The initiatives that we currently have are these. There's Project 1, online collaborative authoring, which is using a platform called Fonto XML. Project 2, Standards of the Future, which is all about smart standards or machine readable content. And Project 4, Open Source Solutions, which is not just about the file format, but also about the license it's issued under. And lastly, there's an initiative called File Attachments to Deliverables, which is a quick and easy solution for dealing with different file formats. So these initiatives are currently part of the program that support our strategy, but the strategy goes to 2030, and these projects have shorter timeframes. So we expect that there'll be more initiatives in this list as time goes on. So let's start going through the initiatives one by one. Firstly, let's start with Project 1, online collaborative authoring. Here you have an overview of the project. This is a project that's being implemented by ISO and IEC, and we're making sure that SEN and Senelec requirements are incorporated. So for example, we need to make sure that the EU directives clauses, Annex ZZ and ZA, are available in the templates. Things like that are different for SEN and Senelec. The project's been implemented in 3 phases, which we're calling steps. Step 1 went live in October 2020, so that's a year ago, and that enabled online collaborative authoring. This is where the drafting body, so the working group, can log in and use the platform to draft a standard or another deliverable. It also enables commenting within the working group. The next step was originally planned to go live a couple of months ago for online commenting from members. However, it's been split into 2 phases. So a couple of months ago, we started to improve the commenting functionality to deal with really large volumes of comments. So things like filtering, tagging, and applying the same resolution to multiple comments, which are really big time-saving features. And then later, so coming up in April next year, we'll enable this for members to do the commenting. So for things like inquiry phases, for example. And the last step will be internal editing. So for SEN and Senelec, that means that the CCMC editing team, instead of having to export a Word document from this tool, that they'll stay within the tool in order to do their editing processes. The idea is that by the end of this project, so that's the start of 2023, it will be available for all committees. Now, this was originally an ISO diagram that I've modified slightly. And in the ISO diagram, they've said the word voluntary. So committees can choose whether to use it. At SEN and Senelec, we believe that this will become mandatory at some point, but we don't know exactly when yet. So at 2023, it will be voluntary most likely, but at some point it will become essential for all of the drafting bodies. Alongside all of this, we have integration. As you can see with number 4 at the bottom. So we're looking at integrating it with SEN documents and the global directory, and of course the IEC equivalents. You can see all of the stars on this diagram. They represent releases. So we've had a lot of different releases as time goes by, because we're working in an agile way, and we're making sure that all of the feedback from the sprints, feedback from the pilot groups are incorporated and form part of each sprint. Why are we implementing this project? Well, there are a lot of really beneficial features. For example, there's normative referencing. So you just pick from a list in the database of normative references, so that you don't have to type everything in manually and get the formatting correct. There's concurrent editing. So you're all working on the same document at the same time. We have features for unlocking and locking clauses so that you make sure nobody else accidentally interferes with what you're trying to do. And there's a whole lot of things for commenting as well, like tagging and filtering that I mentioned, applying multiple, the same resolution to multiple comments. These are all really big features that are time saving, effort saving, as well as improving the different parts of quality as well. There's a lot of features to support the structure and quality of the document in line with the SAN and SENELEC internal regulations, which, as you may know, is the equivalent of the ISO and IEC directives. So this is around what kind of clauses are required that you can't move, a lot of numbering that's done automatically, and this kind of thing. It's really important for transparency and inclusivity, leveraging the access roles that I'll explain in a moment. But sometimes you'll have lots of people who are not part of the, let's say, core team, who don't have an up-to-date copy of the latest document. So this ensures that everybody always has access to the document. And it's a single source of truth. It's the same document that everybody can see. And one of the features is that because there's concurrent editing, that means that there are no separate offline copies that people have to store in their own local file servers, and then you don't have 15 different versions for 15 different people that are all working on the same thing, and then somebody has to merge all of it together at the end. So it avoids a lot of that confusion and a lot of the frustration that can sometimes come with that. But what does it actually look like? It's really good for me to talk about these benefits, but concretely, what would you actually do in this thing? So here's a screenshot. You can see it's browser-based. In this case, it's in Chrome. And basically, the main part of the screen is a document. You've got some menus at the top and some outline and commenting sort of panels on the right. So the layout is actually a lot like Word. There are a lot of videos and things on our project webpage, which you can access via these links. And you can also get sandbox access. So even if you're not ready to start a pilot right now, or maybe you're not from a working group, you're just curious, you can actually get access to log in to a sandbox document and play around with the tool and start to understand it a bit better. One of the really biggest questions that we get is, does this mean that everybody on my working group can change anything in the document? Well, only if you let them, because you as the leader of your working group can control who gets what access. So you can see here there are 3 different levels: leader, author, and contributor, who have different rights. So contributors are basically only able to view and comment. Leaders can do everything, and authors can make changes, but usually they have to be approved by the leader before they're embedded. Normally we encourage to have around 2 to 4 leaders, and then the rest of the team, depending on the way you prefer to work, you can make them all authors or all contributors or a mixture of both. And you can start one way and change it later, because these can be changed at any time. We've been working with a number of pilot groups. As I mentioned, there's a sprint going live every few weeks. And so part of those sprints is to incorporate feedback from our pilot groups. So we've had some of these groups live since the whole project went live in October 2020. And some of them have come on board more recently. And you can see most of these are actually SEN. There are only a couple of SENELEC groups, and they're not representing all members. So we need a lot more pilots, partly because it's slow to get feedback from these groups, because as you're probably aware, you're not working on drafting every week. It takes a long time to get a drafting project done. So they're not all able to provide feedback immediately. We also need more representation from CENELEC, especially. And it's very easy to get involved as a pilot. We just need to go to the expert site, there's one for CEN and one for CENELEC, and follow the link there to express your interest. There's a form you need to fill in, and we validate the information that you've provided to check it's a good match. And if it is, then we can usually get you set up within a few days. We just need your list of users and which roles that you'd like them to have. And the advantage, of course, of being a pilot group is that your feedback will help us shape the future of how this tool will work. All of the feedback from the pilots is being evaluated and considered for improving some of the features as we go through the regular sprints and the regular releases. Now let's move on to project 2, standards of the future. This is where we're dealing with smart standards, sometimes also called machine readable content. Firstly, what are smart standards? So this is a capability model that was first drafted by IEC and has now been adopted by ISO and CEN and CENELEC as well. It refers to the capabilities, so the types of things you can do with a standard that is published at different levels in different ways. At level 0, this is very old school when you have a text file. Actually, it's a printed file, kind of file. Level 1 is document centric. It's available electronically in PDF form, but it's basically one big block. You have the introduction section, the main section, and the conclusion at the end, or the annexes in our case. Level 2 is paragraph centric or clause centric in our case. So each clause is a separate block, but basically it's all quite free text within each of those blocks. We do this today with XML format in the NISO STS structure. Next level is level 3, and it's sentence centric. So each clause would be broken up into sentences, as you can sort of see illustrated here. And there'd be a bit of granularity here. Each sentence would probably have certain tags, probably an ID number, things like this. This is where we want to move to by the end of this project, which is in 2024, to enable this kind of functionality. At that level, you can do things like import it into requirements management systems, which a lot of our standards users want to do. And it enables a lot of other things as well. And the final level, level 4, is data-centric, and it is really to the ultimate level of detail where you can actually match up pieces of data from one clause with another clause, because there's a whole lot of cross-referencing and ID numbers and data structures behind that enable it. So we probably do want to get to level 4 at some point, but it's not in scope of our 2024 time horizon here. Who knows, it could be by 2030 though, we'll see. The project's been underway for a while, and we started with some pilots back in 2019. The first 2 pilots were focused on the construction and petroleum industries, one in each of those. And the goals of those 2 pilots were to find ways to structure provisions. So we're really at exploring kind of mode here. They intended to produce a few different proposed information models, as well as some other deliverables like a final report, that we could then use to start narrowing on which option we wanted to use. After that, the intention was to go with pilots 3 and 4, focused on a product standard that already existed and a new work item. The idea there was to see at the time of creating the content, was there anything in particular that we needed to focus on during that phase, which might be different to compared to if it had already been drafted and you're trying to convert it later. So again, these pilots were trying to test if the proposed information models that were produced from pilots 1 and 2 can capture all of the provisions that are necessary all of the different types of provisions that are necessary to create these kinds of standards. They intended to provide the feedback on the test results and the observations of what worked, what didn't work, what was missing, this kind of stuff. However, when we started with those projects, there was some conflicts and some gaps that were identified that were not easy to figure out. So we started pilot 5 as well, and it ran in parallel to pilots 3 and 4. And so there was a bit of a feedback loop where pilot 5 was developing the formal information model, which will soon be completed. After the end of all of these pilots, we need to figure out next steps. We don't know those next steps yet, and I'll come to that very soon. So the results so far from the pilots that have been run. Firstly, there are some more general kind of lessons learned. Firstly, the provision-centric, which is level 3, which is what we're aiming for, data structuring can be implemented relatively easily. We say relatively because it's not easy. There's still a lot of challenges involved, but compared to level 4, it's a much more manageable kind of task. But even if we go to level 3, that does not solve all of the user needs. For example, it doesn't remove all ambiguity. It doesn't introduce this concept of singularity, which means that one provision is one requirement, because you can still have the word "and" in a sentence. We also found that collaborating with ISO and IEC is very important. ISO has an equivalent initiative called ISO Smart that they're running, and IEC has a group called SG12, which is focused on digital transformation, which touches many parts of the same topics we're looking at. We so far have produced, what have we produced? So we've established user groups in 4 countries. And we've got some other activities going on in a few other countries. Through those user groups, we've collected 100 user stories to understand what is it that users actually need, because that's the reason we're doing this, is to support the needs of users. We've also created a draft level 3 provision-centric information model. It's not currently published online, but will be sometime soon. And we've got 4 potential ways to explicitly or implicitly create smart standards. So what we mean with explicit or implicit is, does the person creating it, drafting it, do they need to separate it into the fields, or does it kind of automatically happen magically for them? So some of these are higher tech and some of these are lower tech, but none of them are ready for production yet. The first one was the smart structuring table, which was an Excel tool, basically different fields in different columns. Then there's the triple structuring tool, which was a piece of custom software that was set up. It's an improvement over Excel because it allows you to do nesting, which is a really important concept in data structuring. Then we looked at Qualis and patterns. So this was a consultancy who helped us look at patterns for creating more natural language sentence structures that would sufficiently capture all of the different cases that we're interested in. And lastly, we looked at natural language processing, which was more of a process for the implicit creation of smart standards. But it's not automated yet, and it could be combined with other approaches. So these are sort of starting points for the next phases of what we'll be doing. How does this affect the technical bodies? So right now, today, interested technical bodies can get involved in a few different ways. One is that they can join a lot of the activities that we're running. So there are national stakeholder groups in some countries. And aside from that, at a central level, we also have info sessions and workshops that you can register for, where you can do things like express your requirements. You may also be able to run a pilot. In our early stages, of course, there will be lower tech pilots, things like filling out the Excel spreadsheet or our custom software to see if your provisions in your document can be accommodated by the information model. But towards the end of the project, there'll be higher tech different kinds of pilots. All of the information for all of those activities and potential pilots will be published on the expert sites. If your technical body is not interested, that's okay. There's no impact on you for now at all. It's only for those who are interested. The project is intended to end by December 2024. And at that date, what will be the impact? We're still figuring this one out. And we will, of course, announce things in due course. But for example, one of the key questions we have is, will this new way of developing standards be relevant for all standards or just some? Because this will require a structure of a way that the content is drafted. So instead of drafting sentences in the way that you have done in the past, you may need to, for example, tag the sentence, and we would need to provide tools for you to do that. So this could be relevant just for some standards or for all of them. We need to figure that out. The next project is Project 4, Open Source Solutions. First, we need to understand what is open source, because it's not obvious for everybody. So it is a design which may be software, but is very often not software, it can be any kind of design, which is issued under a license that satisfies certain criteria. So much more important than the format is the license. It is a very different business model, copyright model. The detailed version is the open source definition. We say the detailed version, but there are competing definitions. We acknowledge that, but this is the one that we're looking at the moment. But the basic idea of any version of open source is that it grants you 4 freedoms. The license grants you 4 freedoms. The first one is the freedom to use it for any purpose that you like. The freedom to understand how it works. So in the case of software, that means to view the source code. But in other types of designs, that'll mean different things. The freedom to understand it. The freedom to improve it, which might mean for general improvements that everybody can use, or it can mean specifically adapting it for your purposes, for example, to integrate it in your environment. And finally, the freedom to distribute it. You can distribute either the original version, or you can redistribute your modified version. And all of this, of course, is for free. So very different to what we do today. Where might this be useful in standardization? So let's take, for example, electronic invoicing. You might have a reference implementation, which means an example of how to implement a standard, for example. So you might have a software tool that produces electronic invoices that conform with an EN, a standard, about electronic invoices. You could also have a testing tool. For example, in the case of electronic invoices, you might have a software tool where you already have an invoice that you've created and you import that into the software tool, and the tool tells you whether or not it conforms by performing a number of checks. It's also relevant in Industry 4.0. For example, you might have some software that's used to operate a sensor array, which is really important for producing interoperable data, for example, to use it with a digital twin. And the way that it produces that data could be in conformity with a European standard. But this is not all about software necessarily. You can have many kinds of design. For example, you could have hardware. We might have a standard that defines how 3D printers must work. And so you could have a reference implementation of how to create a 3D printer, an example of a design for one. So these are examples that are not necessarily all real today, but they're just to get your imagination going of what could be possible if we were able to publish all kinds of different designs. Some common misunderstandings about open source. So just because it's free doesn't mean it costs nothing. There is a lot of cost involved because all of the management, basically, and the platforms that are used still cost time and money. So although it is usually downloaded for free, it can actually be sold. And it's not usually done because it doesn't make a lot of commercial sense, just plain selling an open source deliverable. But it is often sold along with other things as a package. So for example, when you buy your new mobile phone, it's not only the hardware, but it's also the open source software that sits inside it that you're getting. So you're kind of buying them both as a package. And you can also get it packaged with support services as another one. People often think that you have to return or publish changes. So yes, you do have the freedom to modify the open source design, and you do have the freedom to distribute either the original or the modified open source design, but you do not have the obligation to distribute it. This is a choice. A lot of the time people do publish it, but they're not required to. So what are we doing on this project now that we know what open source is? We want to create an open source, a framework for open source deliverables that goes through all of the life cycle stages. And we basically end up with a new deliverable type. So this would be separate to an EM, separate to a TR, separate from all of our existing ones. We're looking at creating a new one, not modifying any of the existing ones. At proposal stage, we probably need to incorporate this into the new work item process and form. And we'd need to be clear about what it is that's being proposed. For example, is it a reference implementation, which is an example of how to implement a standard? A testing tool to check for conformity with a standard, or something else. So these are the two most obvious and most common types of situations that we've encountered. But we're open to other ideas as well. So if there's creativity out there, then we're open to people expressing that. We need to support the development phase of the deliverable. So we're looking at repositories like probably either GitHub or GitLab. We might also have a communication tool, like a messaging tool, for example, to enable the developers to coordinate with each other. We need to figure out the approval stage, and this is a very challenging one because we need to make sure we uphold our values. For example, making sure that everybody has a voice and making sure that we have a good level of quality. But we have different expectations in terms of speed, and we possibly have different types of skills required to do this approval. So we're going to have a look at, for example, the formal vote stage and the public inquiry, exactly how they work and exactly how we might want to modify them to make it more appropriate for this type of deliverable. Publication and download kind of go together because it's published under a license, which satisfies the open source definition, which of course means it's downloaded for free. So this is a huge difference to our normal business model. Normally you pay money to buy a standard, and in this case, you do not pay money to download an open source deliverable. So concretely, how would it work? You would go onto a member website, you'd search for your topic, let's say boat building, type that in and click search. You get a list of results of all of the boat building related deliverables that are there. You might see a couple of ENs, a TR, and then you would see a new kind of deliverable. Let's imagine we call it an OS. So you click on that OS, you would see a few basic details about it, like the name, when it was published, the group responsible for developing it, and then you'd see a hyperlink. You click on that hyperlink and it would take you to the repository, probably GitHub or GitLab, and you would do the download from there, so not on the member website. And then finally, at maintenance time, this is very similar to approval because we need to have good quality and make sure everyone's voice is heard, but we've got the challenge especially of different speed expectations. And this is really important, especially if it's software, because we might have bug fixes that you can't wait to fix, and you might have security patches that you need to incorporate, and you really don't want to wait to fix those ones. So some similar challenges there. So in short, a new deliverable type, which coexists along with our existing deliverable types and is complementary to them because it might relate, for example, to a European standard. So how does this affect you guys in the technical bodies? So as of today, if your technical body is interested, you can join an info session or a workshop, things like that, or you can participate in a pilot, and all of the information is on the expert sites. But if your technical body is not interested, no problem, there's no impact on you. The project is intended to go live in December 2022. And that means that the framework will be available at that point for anybody who wants to use it. So at this point still, if your technical body is not interested, no problem, it's optional, you don't need to use it. If your body is interested, that's when it becomes available for everybody to use. The last initiative that I want to cover is file attachments to deliverables. The problem that needs solving is that today we operate in a nice little checklist where we have a Word document, which we convert to PDF and XML, and we spread these out to the members, and the members make them available on their websites, and everybody's happy. But in the future, and this is already starting to happen, it's already been going on for a number of years now, we have different types of XML files, so not just Word in XML format, but entirely different XML formats. We have Excel spreadsheets that have way too many columns to fit on an A4 page. We have databases, we have audio files, we have video files. We've got lots of creative things that our technical bodies are coming up with that are very relevant to make these standards more useful for users, and therefore they want to publish them. But we have no framework to support this. It's not allowed according to our internal regulations. We have no solution for it. So everybody gets very confused and I dare say a little frustrated because there's no solution. So what are we trying to do? This top part here is the diagram. So basically we want to be able to have additional files get packaged up as part of the zip file. The technical body submits that zip file to CCMC. CCMC publishes that zip file to members, and then members, one way or another, doesn't have to be a zip file, make sure that that appears in their shops, and one way or another that purchasers, when they download, they get not only the PDF file, but they get the Excel file, the audio file, the whatever file is needed. So for example, you get a download button and you get a zip file, or you get two different downloads buttons, one for each file, whichever way they want to do it. This is really simple. We wanted something that was quick and easy to implement because bigger solutions will take more time and we don't want to wait. We've been waiting for a number of years already. This is not yet fully approved by the BTs, the technical boards, but we are currently operating by exception. So some people, some groups have already started using this and it's working well. So we encourage you to work by exception if you would like to do this. We hope that the general solution will be approved during 2022, but we can't guarantee any dates or anything like that. The questions, of course, that you have are what kinds of content can you actually put in here? So first and foremost, there needs to be a reason that you need this as a separate file. There's a reason that you can't reasonably represent it in Word, PDF, or in the future Fonto XML, part of online collaborative authoring. The content should be technical. The purpose should be technical. So yes, you can have a video, but it can't be a marketing video. It needs to show you something technical in that video. You need to make a good choice of the file format. So for example, it should be widely used and accepted, and we prefer non-proprietary file formats. And editing and translating does apply wherever reasonable. So if it's human readable text, we should translate it and it should go through our editing department. But for example, we won't translate computer code or formulas or anything like that. So if you want to go ahead and request an exception, you can do this at any phase of your project. The earlier the better, so that you know what the decision is, and especially because it's not an overnight decision, it takes a couple of months. So firstly, you need to speak to your CCMC project manager and get the link for the form from them. It's not published online anywhere currently. Following that, we'll validate, check everything's okay, see if we've got any questions, and then we'll run 2 consultations concurrently. So one is with Task Force Digital Content, which I manage, and the other one is with the Joint Commercial Advisory Committee, the JCAG. So both of those will take approximately 1 month to run that consultation. So those 2 groups provide their feedback on, firstly, the technical aspects, or IT kind of technical aspects, and then the commercial aspects, to see if there are any financial implications and so on. So the secretary, you, and the CCMC project manager review the feedback from those 2 groups and decide what you want to do next. Maybe you want to cancel it because the feedback was negative and you understand and it seems reasonable, or maybe you want to proceed. So if you proceed, then this is a normal BT decision process. So the project manager is responsible for writing a decision paper and submitting that proposed decision to the technical board. And again, as usual, that usually takes 1 month for a decision to be made. So I'm not sharing here the link to the form, but just this is a little screenshot of a couple of the questions that are out of it, so you can get a feel for how it works. Basically, we're asking, why can't it be represented in Word or PDF? Which file format have you chosen and why? File size, because if it's too large, we might have some problems with storage. And so there are a number of questions like this. And here we get to the bottom line. So what happens concretely if you get a request? What do you do with it? So firstly, you can of course refer back to this presentation, but things are constantly changing. So what I really recommend you do is, firstly, you look on the expert site for the latest info. There's one for SEN and one for CENELEC. Target audience is of course experts, but there's no login required, so anybody can access it. There is 1 page per project, plus 1 for digital transformation overall under key initiatives. It contains a lot of useful information, including, well, general info, but also importantly, calls for participation or calls for pilots, info sessions and workshops, and especially for you guys as possibly secretaries or conveners, then there is a slide deck that you can use to present to your groups, and that's especially important when we're looking for pilots, for example. We're really relying on you guys to spread the word and help us find pilot groups. But sometimes it's not really obvious which project you're interested in. So project 1, online collaborative authoring, is pretty obviously a different category. It's about the way that you draft it, and it's still just basically a normal types of content. It's text and tables and so on. But the other 3 things kind of sound the same. They're different, but the same, because they're all dealing with different types of file formats. So I just want to do a short comparison here to explain the differences between them. Firstly, if we look at the scope. So project 2, Standards of the Future, which is about machine readable or smart, is about the whole pie. It is the whole standard that's being represented in a different format. File attachments to deliverables, however, is just one part of it that's being represented in a different format. The rest of the pie is still in its traditional way in Word and PDF, but this one part is, for example, an audio file. But it's still part of the standard. Open source solutions is an entirely different thing. It's the little cherry that goes on top that makes your pie much more delicious, much more useful. It is a separate deliverable, not part of the EM or the TR or whatever. Formats. So project 2, Standards of the Future. We haven't yet determined the format, but we believe that there will be 1 or 2 formats that people will be required to use. So you can't just use just any format that's out there. You'll have to comply with what is selected there. For open source solutions and file attachments to deliverables, however, it is very open. So yes, we have some guidelines around it should be widely accepted, and it should be preferably non-proprietary, but the list of file formats that exist in the world is constantly increasing. There are always more file formats being created. So even if we did create a list of what's approved or not, it would still be continually updated in the future. So much more flexibility there. In terms of funding, standards of the future and file attachments to deliverables, this is part of the standard. You purchase it for money at the time of buying the standard. Open source solutions is completely different because, as I mentioned, it's published under an open source license, it's downloaded for free. So how do we get money for it? How do we fund our activities? One of the options we're considering at the moment is sort of a fee to participate, a bit like a membership fee. That's a picture of a membership card there. So it would be a bit like a CWA, a SEN workshop agreement. Still to be determined. The license, so this is the copyright and everything. So standards of the future would still be subject to our normal copyright arrangements, which basically say you can't copy it, you can't create derivative works from it, the usual things. The only thing you can do with it is use it to create products that conform with the standard, etc. File attachments to deliverables, I've got a copyright in grey there because at least at this first stage, while we're still thinking about it because it's a quick solution, it would be issued under the same copyright rules, but it's a bit of a grey zone because some of these file formats are desired specifically because we want people to be able to modify them. Let's take, for example, we had a case of image files that needed to be published in SVG, I think it was, format, so that people can actually modify them to adapt these logos or symbols, I should say, to their particular packaging that they were going to put them on. So it's really intended that people modify them and effectively create derivative works from them. So theoretically, that's not allowed under the current copyright arrangements. But I think we'd probably tolerate that kind of behavior because it's probably intended. Open source solutions, as we know, completely breaks the rules. We have 4 freedoms. You can basically do almost whatever you want with it. You can copy it, you can modify it, you can republish it. So a lot of those usual constraints with copyright are not in place for open source. The review cycle is a really important one. So for standards of the future and file attachments to deliverables, we're considering this to be part of the standard. Well, it is the standard, and therefore it's subject to the same rules that they normally are. So that's review every 5 years usually. And if you need to amend it or correct it, then those cycles apply as well. Open source solutions, we're still designing the processes, but we imagine that they will be much more faster, more iterative, perhaps a continuous review cycle rather than once every X years. When are they available? Well, standards of the future won't be available to December 2024. Open source, not until December 2022, so it's end of next year. Whereas file attachments to deliverables is available now. That's with a judge with her hammer, because you still need an approval for an exception. You can do it now, but you need to go through the approval process. So what happens if you get a request now? So for standards of the future and open source solutions, sorry guys, you've got to wait. It's not really available properly right now. Go to our website. You've seen the expert site links. You might be able to participate as a pilot of different kinds, but it's not really operational. It's not for everybody. It's not going to be smooth sailing. File attachments to deliverables, it is available now. So you can go ahead and do that if you've got a specific case that you want to handle. All you need to do is fill in the form. So contact your CCMC project manager, fill it in, and away you go. Last topic that I wanted to mention is that coming soon, so this has been approved by the BTs and we expect it to go live in January 2022, is that there'll be 2 new questions on the new work item form, which is used whenever you're proposing a new work item to be created. So one is whether it's intended to be developed using the online collaborative authoring platform. This obviously relates to Project 1, online collaborative authoring. And the second one is the deliverable is intended to include non-Word or PDF content, for example, audio files, XML schemas, machine readable formats, or software. And so if they tick that one, then there's a free text paragraph. Please provide the details of that content. This could lead to project 2, 4, or file attachments deliverables, so machine readable standards or open source, because it's not easy for everybody to figure out the difference between those and which one is most relevant. And that's exactly why we did the comparison table a minute ago, because it's not obvious for people. In any case, if either of these boxes are ticked, CCMC, probably me, will contact you for feasibility and organizational aspects, because just because you're interested doesn't mean it's necessarily the best solution for you, or that you're a perfect match for the project. So we'll validate it before we invite you to get on board as a pilot or whatever else. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. And you know how to contact me if you have any questions. And as well, there's the expert sites for you to refer to. Thanks, everyone.